Good afternoon.
Good to be here.
Bill, Alliance for Action, we are a progressive group that just started after Trump got elected. We started a year ago, January. We now have an email membership of over 600 people who are very, very interested in progressive issues. Members of the Democratic Club of Santa Rita area are also co-sponsoring this and supportive. And we are extremely happy you're here. And I would like to just turn it over for you. I don't know the kind of information people have about the Arizona Corporation Commission, so you might tell them a little bit about that and about yourself. And I already told them that Sandra could not join us today. And Steve, just for your information, downstairs next to the Italian restaurant, down and straight down, is the Democratic Club headquarters. We have no literature, no petitions. Get them in there. Yeah, now it will probably be closed then because it closes at 2. But before you leave, we will get them because you need to have some information here.
Oh, they're closed now? Oh, shoot. Okay. Well,
They close at 2.
okay.
Okay. Bill Mundell,
Thank you very
one
much.
of my favorite people ever to run for the Arizona Corporation Commission. Here he is.
God, how could, with that introduction,
Yeah.
I better have my A game on with that kind of introduction. Well, it's great to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll talk about the Corporation Commission. You know, and I assume most of you know what the Corporation Commission does or have some inkling. I mean, you know they regulate utilities, right, in Arizona. And if you're from, a lot of us in Arizona are from other states. So in other states, the Corporation Commission is called the Public Utilities Commission. That's what it's called in California. In other states, it's called the Public Service Commission. The Corporation Commission is sort of a misleading name because, well, in territorial days, it was called the Railroad Commission. And then our framers in 1911 and 1912, we were debating the state constitution, named it the Corporation Commission. But they were concerned, if you recall that era, it was the progressive era, Teddy Roosevelt and the Trustbusters. They were concerned about the power of monopolies and the power of Standard Oil. And so now we fast forward 100 years, and we have those same concerns about the power of the big utilities in the state of Arizona, and we'll talk about that in a second. You know, I've had the honor and the privilege to serve in all 4 branches of Arizona's government. And I did say 4 branches because the Corporation Commission is considered a 4th branch of government in Arizona, one of only 7 states where it's established by the state constitution, and one of only 13 states where the commissioners are elected. Now, why is that important? And I don't take credit for this. One of my colleagues once said this. It's the most powerful institution in Arizona government that most people know nothing about. The most powerful because of the jurisdiction that it holds over our lives. And because of that combination of it established in the Constitution and the commissioners are elected, they have great independence. They don't serve at the pleasure of the governor. In those other 37 states, they're appointed by the governor and confirmed by probably the state senate. And then a lot of those states, they serve at the pleasure of the governor. So if the governor doesn't like one of your decisions, you're gone. You're gone. And then the fact that it's in the state constitution means this crazy legislature that we have, they can't change it. A lot of the jurisdiction, the rate-making jurisdiction that the commission has by statute, because the Constitution obviously is higher than the statute. So only the people of Arizona can take away the authority of the commission by changing the Constitution. Now, I started to say I've had the honor and the privilege to serve in all 4 branches of Arizona's government. I was very fortunate. I started my career fighting corruption in Chandler as a young lawyer. And what were we fighting? Back then, the police officers were stopping people without probable cause, searching homes without search warrants, and if you can believe this, actually listening in on the attorney-client telephone conversations from the jail. And I got involved with a couple other young lawyers, Socorro Morales, and he's passed away, God rest his soul, and Wayne Lewis, and we got involved in a recall. We got a new city council And then I was fortunate, I got appointed as the presiding judge when I was 28, the Chandler Municipal Court. And I served in that capacity for 6 years, then resigned and served in the legislature for 6 years. And I was the chairman of the House Environment Committee. And that's actually where I met my super volunteer back there, Steve Brittle. He's known me for probably 26 years. And we got involved, and as the chairman of the committee, I sponsored and co-sponsored a lot of legislation protecting Arizona's environment, including the state's first recycling bill that requires towns and cities to give their citizens an opportunity to recycle. This may not mean a lot to you down here, but legislation protecting the Phoenix Mountain Preserves up in the Phoenix area. And then where Steve and I really met was over preventing Arizona from becoming the dumping ground of the United States for hazardous waste. I was the chairman of the Environment Committee. He was a citizen activist. And we got involved and we stopped it. And we prevented Arizona from becoming the dumping ground for hazardous waste. Then fast forward, I went back, left the legislature, again, practiced law in Chandler. I'm a lawyer. Don't hold that against me, please, then was... Well, Miriam, yeah, but I'm the politician running for office. But I guess she's your leader here, so you guys don't have anything against lawyers then. And then I've known Lawrence back there for years. He practiced in front of the commission when I was there, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in any event, so I went back into private practice. Then in 1999, I was appointed by the governor. There was a vacancy on the Corporation Commission, and I was appointed by the governor and then served for 9 years, 9.5 years actually. And I was chairman in 2001 and 2002. And during that time period, we were one of the first states, and I'm always careful, I don't want to say the first state. We were one of the first states to require utilities to get a percentage of their electricity from renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar or other renewable sources. And it was a very small percentage. It maxed out at 1.1%. Now think about that. That was 17 years ago. And even back then, the utilities fought us. I can tell you that. And then in 2006, I co-authored along with my colleague Chris Mays and the other commissioners. We drafted and enacted, I should say, the Renewable Energy Standard, the REST rules, R-E-S-T, Renewable Energy Standard Tariff. And that required our utilities to get 15% of their electricity from renewables by the year 2025. And that was 12 years ago. And what I've said, and again, I was the Democratic nominee for the Corporation Commission 2 years ago, one of the nominees, and we'll talk about that race in a second. And what I said in my last campaign is I said, we're long overdue to look at increasing that percentage. There's a decent percentage 12 years ago. And now what do we need? And I said that 2 years ago, and we'll talk about that in a second. I asked the question rhetorically, don't you think we should be the solar capital of the world? Don't you think we should? I mean, considering, we live in sunny Arizona. Pretty obvious. And so we passed those REST rules, and since I left, and my running mate Sandra Kennedy left, and Chris Mays left, and some of the other commissioners, there's been a gradual erosion or chipping away at that standard. And there hasn't been a direct attack. There hasn't been a direct attack on the 15%. It's been an indirect attack. Because I can tell you the utilities and the commission don't want a headline in the Green Valley News or the Arizona Republic, commission reduces percentage from 15 to 12 to 10. So they've done it, they've done away with some of the incentives, the rebates, the net metering, and all sorts of, we were actually moving very well on our way, 11%, I think it is, to the 15%. And then these attacks started happening on the renewable energy standard, and just right after the last August in the APS rate case, they made it less financially viable for people to put rooftop solar on. And we'll talk about that in a second. It's real policy wonkish. Larry will know it. He'll probably be able to explain it better than I can. And he appeared in front of me on numerous occasions. So did his sidekicks sitting next to him. And I didn't always vote in their favor. I mean, he can tell you that. I did not always vote in their favor. But I always tried to be fair, objective, listen to the evidence and the facts, and make a decision because it's quasi-judicial. It's like a judge. But what's happened in recent times is that you have the commissioners that were elected in 2005 2014 and 2016, they were elected with a lot of money spent on their behalf by the biggest utility in the state, APS. Everybody know who Pinnacle West is? Pinnacle West, anybody know? Some people say no. Good. I mean, I like to ask questions. The reason I ask that question is because Pinnacle West is the holding company of APS. So everybody knows APS. You know, goes up. It's like Tucson Electric and Unisource. So Pinnacle West is up here at the holding company, and APS is the utility. But all the money flows upward. You know, the rates from the customers go upstream. So Pinnacle West. The reason I say that is because in my election 2 years ago, and then I'll talk about Sandra's election in a second, in 14, well, I'll talk about hers first. And I'll digress for a second. You all know about the Dirty Money Initiative, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I say that Sandra Kennedy is Exhibit A when it comes to being the victim of dirty money in Arizona, because in 2014, at least $3.2 million in dark, dirty money was spent to defeat her in 2014. 2014. Well, wait till I tell you what they spent to beat me. 2014. And we don't know the exact amount of Sandra Kennedy's money spent against her. One commissioner, it's a 5-commission, all Republicans, but one commissioner, Bob Burns, has been fighting tooth and nail to get to the bottom of how much actual money Pinnacle West, remember the name Pinnacle West, it's important, spent against Sandra Kennedy. And they just recently, in a court decision, and I don't quite understand the decision, but it says that one commissioner can issue a subpoena or call utility executives in, but I guess if they decide to blow you off and don't want to come in, then it takes the majority of the commissioners to enforce the subpoena. And so I make the analogy, well, then it's not worth a lot. It's like a judge, like in the Mueller investigation, issuing a subpoena and they just blow him off and don't come. Well, that's the same thing here. And so what the court said is it takes a majority of the commissioners to enforce the subpoena. That's why it's really important to get Sandra and I elected, because we'll have a majority, 3 out of 5. I wasn't very good at math, so I went to law school instead. But we'll have 3, and we'll be able to enforce that subpoena if that decision of that judge is upheld in the appellate courts. But having said that, so in my race in 2016, I was actually winning, I started to say, by about 11,000 votes on October 20th. How do we know that? Because on election night, they flash up. The first votes that come out are the early voting votes, right? From the Secretary of State's office. So election night, I mean, pretty excited, we're winning. There's no statewide elected Democrats in Arizona, none whatsoever, none, no statewide So I'm maybe getting the nose in the camel's tent by winning. And they're pretty excited at the Democratic headquarters, the party that night. And then as the night went on, we ended up losing by 35,000 votes out of 2.6 million cast, less than 1%, 0.7%. Not that I'm keeping track. 0.7%. Okay, and so what did they spend against me? Well, we know they've disclosed, it looks like between $4 and $10 million. They've disclosed, and I tell people, I guess some of the benefits, the one benefit of running and losing, is that they've at least disclosed they spent $4 million against me, but they don't disclose it until March of the next year. So no one knew back in November, and that's why I said Pinnacle West ran the commercials against me and my running mate Tom Chabin. And so they disclosed they spent $4, but if you look at the filings, and because under Citizens United, you all know, I know everybody knows about Citizens United, under the IRS code, when do you file your tax returns? Well, you file them in April of the next year, or you can get an extension until October. Okay, so no one knows how much the dark, dirty money has been spent against Exhibit B. Sandra's Exhibit A, I say I'm Exhibit B, right? So we ended up losing by that very small amount. Now, why do you think they did that? Why do you think they did that? Because they know that Sandra and I, as I said earlier, will be fair, objective, give Larry, a fair shake when he appears in front of us, and other parties and and customers in particular. But they don't want commissioners like that. They want commissioners. They got two in 2014 and 2 in 2016. And in the APS rate case, what do you think the vote was? It was 4-1, because Bob Burns is the only one standing up to him. And the same thing on almost every issue, 4-1. And they provide money, taxpayer money, for their lawyers in that case that I was telling you about, the disclosure case, because they're on the same side as APS in the court case, and they won't pay for Bob's attorneys. So he's fortunate to have a lawyer working pro bono for him to help him right now. But think about that. And so that's what's happening as we go forward. Now, in the last campaign, we talked. If you have any questions, interrupt me, because I mean, I can, I like answering questions. I can, as a recovering politician and a lawyer, I mean, I can stand up here and talk for hours. But sometimes, it's, if you wanted, I won't be, offended. Yes, okay.
I do.
It's the lawyer asking the question.
Exactly.
Okay.
I do remember their campaign and what they said about your Republican opponents. Would you, for people who may not have been here then, what did they argue your Republican opponents were? Yeah,
thanks for reminding me.
Yes.
Because sometimes I'll say it without being reminded, but thank you, because their commercials were, and I called it, and remember, it was magnified, the $4 to $10 million, because they spent it in the last 2.5 weeks of the campaign. So it wasn't just like the whole campaign for a year, or even now in March till November. It was magnified by those 2.5 weeks, and I call it carpet bombing. I mean, it was nonstop. You turn on the Today Show and it was there, or the local news. You turn on Colbert at nighttime, it was there. I go, this is not good. I mean, I'm sitting there going, and because we're running as clean election candidates, and we'll talk about that in a second. If I don't talk about that, my super volunteer will get upset with me. We have to get $2,005 contributions. We don't accept any PAC money or lobbyist money or special interest money, but we get, and it's kind of unique for Arizona. People that are new to Arizona are kind of blown away by the fact that we have public financing of our elections. I mean, Arizona does. It was passed by the people, of course, not the legislature. People are much more progressive than our legislature when it comes to things that get on the ballot. And that's why they fight so hard to keep them off, just like with the SOS, the Save Our Schools initiative on vouchers. And then Maine and Massachusetts have public financing, to the best of my recollection. But having said that, so we had very little money to respond to them. And so obviously they chipped away that 11,000 vote lead, and election night, we saw it dwindle. But their commercials said, the sustainable solar team. The Republicans. They're going to be the sustainable solar team. That was what and then it got worse. They went to the Republican playbook. I mean, that is debatable. I'll try to be objective, the judge in me or the lawyer. Okay, sustain, okay. But the second part of the commercial said that they were going to keep your taxes low. Well, the commission they don't set the tax rates. The legislature does, or like the recent federal law, where they lowered taxes, the federal law, same thing in the legislature. The commission implements them and make sure that the utilities are collecting it properly and paying it out properly. So that's what it was, the sustainable solar team. And so and so that's what we were up against. So in the last campaign, what did we say? We kind of had three themes, three issues. They're going to crush solar, rooftop solar in Arizona, which they've pretty much done. They're going to have unjustified rate increases. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the corruption issue. And, people thought that when we were talking about the corruption issue, that we were being hyperbolic or exaggerating or crying wolf because we were in a political campaign. But because I was there 9.5 years, I mean, some people still talk to me that work there and kind of tell me things. They say, Bill, you can't believe kind of what's going on here. Sure enough, do you know what happened? Everybody know? Last May, the former chairman of the commission was indicted for bribery, along with his wife, along with the owner of the big water company, and their lobbyists. They're scheduled for trial in federal court in May. It's the real deal. It's the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's not a political prosecution. It's like Mueller. I mean, this is the real deal. It's the U.S. Attorney's Office, investigated by the FBI, turned over to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I see some people are taking notes. I mean, I would just Google corruption, Google APS, Google Pinnacle West, Google Johnson Utilities, Google Gary Pierce, or just corruption and the Corporation Commission. You'll have more reading material than you probably ever wanted to read. And you know what my running mate calls the commission now? Which she dubbed it. I wish I had thought of it. The Arizona Corruption Commission. The Arizona, and it's sad. I mean, I mean, the Arizona Corruption Commission. And one of the reasons I ran 2 years ago, because I thought I'd ended my public service career. Like I said, I mean, I served there 9.5 years. Really thought I'd ended it. And I'll tell you a little bit about my wife in a second, but because I think it's pertinent to what's happening. But I got so disheartened by behavior and what was happening there that I decided to run again, which I did in 14. Like I told you, I started my political career fighting corruption as a young lawyer in Chandler, and I'd like to end it fighting corruption at the commission and exposing what's happened there. Because if you can expose that dark money and that's been spent by these different organizations, whether it's Pinnacle West or the Koch brothers or DeVos or all of these folks, it's all tied in together. Have you guys been seeing the commercials on how great public education is in Arizona?
Yes. Yeah.
Have you been seeing those?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Have you looked closely to see who's one of the major funders of the commercials? Have you? Next time you watch the commercial, record it and watch it. You know who one of the major funders is? Yes. Pinnacle West. The major utility in the state, Pinnacle West, is the major funder of it. So they're taking money and what I've said is they crushed solar in Arizona. Now they want to crush public education. What the heck does the major utility in the state have anything to do with public education? Because they support Ducey and the whole cadre of dark money and all that's infiltrated. We're like the laboratory for dark money and the Koch brothers in the United States. Yeah, wait 1 second. If you haven't had a chance, before I forget, read the book Dark Money. Honestly, read the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer, a Pulitzer Prize winning author. Because if you haven't, when you read it, first you'll get depressed, right? Then you'll get angry, and then hopefully you'll get fired up, which I know you are. You wouldn't be here today listening to me. But just read it, and you'll see where we're the litmus test for the dark money. And I'll throw out a couple examples. One of the more recent appointees to the Arizona Supreme Court, Clint Bullock, was a young lawyer and went to the Koch brothers in Kansas, to their corporate headquarters, to get his startup money for his quote-unquote public interest law firm that fights environmental regulations, that fights worker safety regulations, that fights all sorts of regulations. He's now on the Arizona Supreme Court. This is 25 years ago. I didn't know that until I read the book. And I'm reading this going, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And so that's a classic example. And then did you know we have Koch brothers schools at our universities?
Yes.
Some of you knew that. Yeah, at ASU and U of A, Koch brothers schools. Funded by taxpayer dollars. When I say that, I mean they get and in fact it's an earmark, meaning in the appropriations it doesn't just go to the university like most of the money. They can spend it how they think it's appropriate. This is actually what's called an earmark, where it has to go to establish these schools at ASU and U of A for the Koch brothers. And then the governor's chief of staff. You ever heard of the name Kirk Adams? He's the governor's chief of staff. You'll see him in the book. I knew about him because he was over in California and they were doing dark money over there and they got fined and penalized for their activities. Now, we talked about why this dark money is happening because of Citizens United. But a lot of people misinterpret what Citizens United said. Citizens United didn't say you couldn't have disclosure of money spent by corporations on campaigns. What it did is it lifted the caps on how much money they could spend. But in that decision is some dicta, that's the legal term or we're not deciding that issue today, but we're going to say something about it. Because that wasn't the issue to be decided in the Citizens United case and some companion cases. But it did, so it lifted the caps on how much corporations could spend and not have to disclose it. But it also left open the door for disclosure, and even Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia, most conservative justice who has a reputation for defending the First Amendment, said that left it up to the states and Congress to require disclosure. And he also said, in his opinion, without disclosure, our democracy is doomed. Now think about that. Without disclosure, our democracy is doomed. And if people don't have the courage to stand up on the courthouse square and state their opinions and not do it in hiding, that our democracy is doomed. And so what it said was, it left it to the states and Congress. California has passed very, very strict disclosure laws. Okay, blue state. But so did Montana. Montana's kind of a purple state now. It used to be a red state, but so did Montana. You know what our legislature did? Senate Bill 1416 made it easier to hide the money. That was 2 years ago. Now they have legislation now, this year, to make it even easier to hide the money. It's a shell game. It goes from this LLC to this LLC to this corporation, and it's impossible. And then it finally goes to the political consultants, like in my case. They were back in Washington, that ran the commercials against Tom Chapin and I in the last election. And I don't know where the political consultant firm was. I think they were from actually Phoenix in Sanders' case, and ran the commercials against her. So it goes here, here, here to the consultant. So that's kind of what is happening. But the commission, because it's so unique, established by the Constitution, we can delve into it. If we get those 3 votes, we can look into the dark money spending by APS. We can look into that. We can require, that's what I was telling you, that court case said, that it requires 3 commissioners to compel them, and then if they don't do it, then go to court and ask for contempt for violating the commission order. Any question? Yeah, please.
The Corporation Commission has authority over rates for water companies, right?
It's a great question. I should have said it earlier in my intro, and I started to say, the impact that it has on the lives of Arizonans. And so let's go through that, and hopefully I won't forget any. But yes, to answer your question directly, it has jurisdiction over approximately 300 private water and sewer companies. Private, not if it's like the city of Phoenix or Scottsdale or Tucson, no, but private water companies. Down here, yes, in this area, private water companies. It has jurisdiction over gas companies, Southwest Gas and other gas companies. It decides, it has jurisdiction for landlines, not cell phones, but landlines. And then make sure that the pipes that go to our gas stations are safe, pipeline safety. And if you have natural gas at your home to heat or cook with, to make sure those pipes are safe. It has railroad safety, to make sure the railroad tracks are safe in Arizona. It has what I call a mini SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. If you have a problem with a stockbroker or other financial advisor, you can go to the commission and file your complaint, and the commission will investigate it with their lawyers and investigators to determine whether there's been a violation of law. So it's mini Securities and Exchange Commission is what I call it. And in fact, you may or may not remember this. I was on American, well, you don't remember this, but I'll just say I was on American Greed a number of years ago in my youth. We did the Baptist Foundation. The Baptist Foundation was one of the biggest, what's called affinity fraud cases. Affinity, is a fancy word for religious fraud in the United States, one of the biggest. And we were able to get about 70% of the dollar back, which is pretty good on the money that's was taken in the fraud cases. Because I can tell you, normally once they get your money, it's going to go to Mercedes and Rolexes and boats and mansions. It ain't ever going to get found or gotten back for the victim most of the time. Maybe a small percentage. We got about 70% back, and most of it was from malpractice carriers, from Arthur Anderson, the accountants, and oh yeah, and the law firms that represented them. And we got malpractice insurance. We got quite a bit of money back, but that's what the commission does. Investigates securities, and then I think one of the things that's really important. I mean, it's like just what it sounds like. Corporations, it's where you file your articles of incorporation, or if you want to form an LLC. But that's more like a county recorder's office. Yeah. As long as you pay your money and dot your I's and cross your T's, you'll get incorporated, or your LLC will get started. But they have that jurisdiction also. But one of the more important functions, and it has about 11 functions. The commission has about, not separated out, but when I was counting them the other day, when it's the legal department or the budget or administration, I mean about 11 different functions that the commissioners oversee when they're as commissioners. Because commissioners are like, on their administrative side of their responsibilities, like the board of directors, and then they hire executive directors like the CEO that makes sure the trains run on time every day. But the commissioners are up here as the board of directors, and they hire that CEO. But I think one of the more important aspects that the commission has is power plant and transmission line siting. They decide where the major transmission lines go in Arizona, major, you heard me say, and the power plant. So they decide. And when I was there, we approved power plants, and sometimes we didn't approve power plants. Yes?
Well, I asked the water question.
And I said yes. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you did answer my question, thank you. But the reason I asked that was, does the APS power plant that's out of Wilcox, do they use groundwater that they're just tapping into that is not part of a water company, or are they pulling in water from a water company? The reason I'm asking is I was headed down to Sunsites with a Democratic candidate for LD14 in 2014. And I took a back road, the one that goes parallel to 10. And on one side are pecan orchards, the other side is what I was told later was an ethanol cornfield. As I was approaching that intersection, they were there and there, the road started to buckle. There were signs warning you that there was subsidence, which means groundwater was being sucked out. When I got to Sunsites, the biggest problem they were having was water and wells drying up. Small truck farms down there having water, no water available, and they blame APS. Now, the two other things that are happening there, ethanol corn and pecan orchards, are also drawing a lot of water. But that APS plant there, that's a big plant. Where do they get water from? How much do they use? And is there any way the Corporation Commission can have any supervision over that?
Well, my first answer is I don't know. I don't know where. I mean, they're getting it, from the groundwater, I assume, because I don't think they're piping it in. Maybe. Can I give a lifeline, Larry? Do you know?
Listening to the lady's question, Bill, thinking that maybe the Arizona Electric Power Co-op Apache plant in that part of the state. I don't think APS has any.
Yeah, I didn't either, but I didn't want
to. Oh, so that's not an APS plant? Yeah.
No, well, it's not. But with regard to the ability of a power plant to use water, one of the provisions under the groundwater code is you can get a groundwater withdrawal permit for power generation. So the agency there would be the Department of Water Resources.
Who were at this meeting in Sunsites?
Yeah, and that's why when you
said not their fault.
Thank you, Larry, because I didn't want to say something I didn't know the answer to, but that's when you said APS. I didn't know there was an APS plant there, so it's the co-op, I assume. Yeah. But whatever power plant it is, it's getting groundwater. They were at the DWR, which is the Department of Water Resources, a separate state agency, was at the meeting or there.
Yeah, there was a representative from them. The meeting prior to this, they had the two LD2 state representatives. Both said, "No, we can't do anything about it. Not our problem." And the guy from the state water agency, whatever it was basically saying the same thing. And part of his message was, well, buyer beware. You farmers should have known that was happening before you you planted your little fields.
Well, it'd be interesting to see what their permit allows. I mean, Larry's right. I mean, you know, they get a permit, and it allows them to do the pumping. And I don't know the answer. I mean, we could research, you know, we could look into that.
The
But
Corporation Commission doesn't.
well, let me yes and no. Let me do it this way, sort of indirectly. And I'll tell you a war story because you can see, I can tell you what I've done. Can't really tell you what I'm going to do in the future because as judges, we have to remain objective and listen to all the evidence. And sometimes people get frustrated with candidates for the Corporation Commission because you, again, are supposed to keep an open mind when a case comes in front of you. And I used to say, you know, it'd be like a judge saying, bring in the next guilty defendant. Now let's hear the evidence. Right? So, but people get frustrated. They say, oh, you don't want to answer our question. You're trying to avoid it. Now, legislators can directly answer the question. It's different with commissioners because they're like judges. So you have to be very, very careful how you answer a hypothetical going forward because you might get disqualified by one of the parties saying, you said this in Green Valley that you would never support a power plant that used groundwater. Well, you'd probably be done listening to power plant cases. You know, you have to be very careful. But let me give the war story, and then Steve, I see Marshall, you had a comment too. You had a question earlier. You put your hand up. Do you want to? I don't want to ignore you. I don't want to ignore you twice because you had your hand up earlier, and then
it has to do with our plan.
Okay, so let me give you a quick war story because I think it illustrates the point. You asked me earlier about the authority of the commission. We had an application when I was at the commission up near the Kingman area, near the Big Sandy. Lawrence is smiling; he remembers near the Big Sandy River, a power plant, and it was going to deplete the groundwater, or the concern was, let me just say that, of the Big Sandy River. I asked that question the other day, and a lot of people didn't know where the Big Sandy is, but it's up near Kingman, and it's one of the last free-flowing rivers like the San Pedro in Arizona. And the concern was that it was going to deplete the groundwater. And so we were under heavy, heavy political pressure to approve it. I mean, getting letters and calls from congressmen and the governor's office, and that goes back to what I talked about, having independence, because I had those calls as commissioner. You know, oh, we'd like you to vote yes on that rate case, or we'd like you to do this for the governor. And I say, well, thank you, Governor, very much, for your input. I'll certainly take that into consideration in making my decision. But in those other 37 states where the governor appoints the commissioners, what do you think? How do you think that phone call is going to end? Right? So in the Big Sandy case, we voted no. We turned it down because we were concerned about the groundwater being depleted. But that's on the front end. Before you issue the CCNN, or the environmental certificate of compatibility. Excuse me, because once you do that, then they have a property right, and it's very difficult to then take it away from them. You can do it on the front end, like we did in my example, the Big Sandy. We stopped it. It didn't get built. And then we had another power plant out near Yuma, Weldon area, and I voted no. It was a 2-to-1 vote, as I recall. I voted no because, again, there was a concern about the groundwater depletion, and there was an option with air-cooled, kind of like an old VW engine. It wasn't going to be quite as efficient, right? They're not. That's why they became water-cooled, but it still would have solved the problem. You would have had a power plant, but you wouldn't have used groundwater. It would have been air-cooled. But again, it wasn't quite as efficient, but I voted no. It was a 2-to-1 vote, as I recall. So I'm just giving you war story examples where, yes, on the front end, the commission has authority, great authority, over what kind of power plants we're going to have. Are we going to have coal? Are we going to have fossil fuel? Are we going to have solar? So on the front end. On the back end, it's much more difficult because of the property right issue. The same thing with transmission lines. We decide where the big, gigantic transmission lines go in Arizona. And I think it's on Tangerine Road, as I recall. I think. Don't hold me to that. But there was a approval of a transmission line years ago, 20, 30 years ago. They got their certificate of environmental compatibility, is what it's called. That's the license the commission gives to utilities to build power plants and transmission lines. But it was out in the middle of nowhere back then, 30 years ago. And then the city grew up around it. And then all of a sudden, and it hadn't been built yet. And then all of a sudden they started building it, and you can imagine what hit the fan, right? I mean, people were upset, but they'd already gotten it. And so what I started doing as I don't know if I was chairman at the time or I was I put that in quotes, or a commissioner, either one, they all had one vote, we started putting time limits in them, saying you've got to build within 5 years. I mean, I thought of these things. We did a bunch of stuff. We said, okay, we're going to put time. I saw what happened there. I said, okay, going forward, we're going to put a time limit in. You have 5 years to build. If not, you have to come back to the commission and reapply. Or we also did this. Just like we made them put up, the utilities put up major signs so you didn't have buyer beware saying this is the future corridor of utility transmission line. Just like they do sometimes with roads or freeway expansion. We started putting that in the order. The commissioners can order, that's why they're so powerful. They can order utilities to do things because they're monopolies. And that's, again, why the commission was established, to protect the public, protect you all captive customers, because you don't have a choice. It's not like buying a Ford or a Chevy, or a Honda or a Nissan. You don't have a choice. So the commission's there to protect you, or at least it's supposed to be there to protect you against overreaching by powerful monopolies, like the railroads and Standard Oil, and now APS, Trico, Pinnacle, all of them. I mean, whether the commissioner is supposed to be fair and protect you guys because you don't have a choice. So, Marshall, you had a question?
Last Tuesday, Tempe voted 91%.
Yes, they did.
To require complete disclosure of all black money. And then the article in the paper said Phoenix is looking at it for next week. Do you think that this might grow?
Well, yes, it's awesome.
Wow.
But let me give you the downside with this legislature. This is important for you guys. Yes, they passed, I think, 91%.
91%.
I was there Tuesday night at the election leave party. I mean, we were celebrating. We were celebrating some pro-solar candidates that got some got reelected, some got elected on the Tempe City Council, and then they had the dark money issue passed 91%, and then Phoenix is debating it. But what's happening is there's legislation now pending to preempt the cities and towns from passing dark money disclosure ordinances. This legislature, of course, just like they did with plastic bags and other things. Now, and guns, the smelting of the guns, yes, but that's what they're doing. There's legislation now pending to override that Tempe vote and the Phoenix vote. So it's going to, honestly, it's going to take a change in we got to change this legislature.
Yes.
And we got to change this commission. I'm telling you, because we can get in there. They're scared to death. That's why they spent so much money against me in the last election and Sanders. We'll get in there and we'll get to the bottom of how much money they're spending. Let me just tell you one other thing. You guys have heard about the Clean and Healthy Initiative? They go 50% renewables by 2050. Okay, it's an initiative. I don't know if it hasn't. They're getting ready to get the petition signed. They filed. Do you have?
In Arizona.
Yes. Oh yeah. By Tom Steyer. The guy who you see him. He's sponsoring it. He's helping pay for it. 50% by the year 2050. Remember I said well, ours is 15%, and I said it's time to increase it. I said that 2 years ago. Yes, it's time to increase it. But let me just tell you what's happening is, again, at this crazy right-wing legislature, there's APS ran down to the legislature with their lobbyists, Pinnacle West, and now they have a bill pending to make it just like a petty offense, no fine whatsoever if a utility violates a commission order. So the commission, let's say this were to pass, let's go through this. Healthy Initiative passes. Then APS doesn't abide by it. The commission issues an order telling them to abide by it. They ignore it. The commission can only then impose very minimal fines against them. Now, I think, setting aside the public policy issues, I think it's unconstitutional because there's already a constitutional provision. I think it's Article 15, Section 16 or 19. I may interpose my numbers. But there's already a constitutional provision that sets the dollar amount. up to $5,000 per violation in the Constitution. So I'm not sure this legislation is constitutional. That's why I said setting aside but they're going to try it. I only thought it was going to take one commissioner to get the books and records, and this judge said no, it takes 3. So I mean, I was wrong on my analysis. I still like to think I'm right, but you know, we'll see if an appellate court changes it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously, you know, very, you know, well versed in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But the big thing is you need to get elected.
Uh-huh.
And what does the recent vote by the commission, I don't know who you're going to be running against on the Republican side, but the recent vote by the commission kind of puts 2 of the people, Tobin and what's the other guy's name, Freeze, looking pretty good because they teamed up with Burns to pass the solar initiative.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, Faris is not running again for the commission, even though he's not termed out. Now, let me digress. So I was there 99 to 2008. I couldn't run again because of term limits. So I bring that up because he's not termed out yet. But in his first year, he's a very ambitious politician. In the first year he was on the commission, which I think obviously is a great public policy position. That's why I'm running again. He announced he's running for treasurer. So there'll be no incumbent in one slot. Now, Commissioner Little, who got elected, you know, with the APS money in 14, left to work in the Trump Department of Energy.
Well, that's one good thing Trump did.
Well, I don't know. Well, anyway.
Got him out of there.
Yeah, well, but then the governor got to appoint his replacement, Justin Olson, who, if you look at his campaign filings when he was a legislator, got thousands of dollars from Pinnacle West. So he's on the commission, so he'll be a quasi-incumbent. I mean, that's what I was when I got appointed. Remember, I got appointed in 99 and they had to run in 2000. So there is some benefit to being an incumbent. I mean, that just goes with the territory.
But he voted against that.
Yeah, he did. So that didn't surprise me. I mean, you know, he's, like I said, if you look at his track record.
So that's who you'd be running against?
Yes.
Okay.
One open spot with no incumbent, and then Justin Olson. Now, you just made me think of something. Let me just say this about the dark money. One of the Republicans that's running, Eric Sloan, I'll say his name again, Eric Sloan. He was the chairman of the Pinnacle West APS Independent Expenditure Committee that ran the $4 to $10 million campaign against Tom Chabin and I in the last election. Now think about that. He was the chairman of the Political Action Committee that got formed on October 21st to run the $4 to $10 million against Tom Chabin and me. So now if he gets elected, how the heck is that guy going to be objective? Remember I talked about being objective and fair? How's he going to be fair? I mean, if APS comes before him for a rate case. Yes.
Well, I'm one of the people on the A-grade political the political candidates committee, and I took on the job of researching your opponents and to try to give some analysis of vulnerabilities. And I can't tell you how much stuff I've downloaded on Eric Sloan so far. I mean, it's a stack like this. It's like, and I haven't had time to read it. So what I would like to know is, you know, of your Republican opponents, who do you think has the best shot of, because there's 2 seats, who are the 2 that you think you're going to end up running against? And what do you think are the major vulnerabilities besides Sloan's, you know, being married to Pinnacle?
Well, Rodney Glassman was a former Democrat city council member in Tucson.
Right.
Correct, Rodney Glassman. He ran against McCain. Talk about ambitious politicians. He's probably in his mid-30s, but you know, I'm not going to hold that against him because I was 28 when I got appointed as a presiding judge. But having said that, he was a Democrat city council member in Tucson that then last year switched parties and became a Republican. He comes from a pretty wealthy family, as I understand it, out of California, and he's got all the big conservative Republicans supporting him. Bill Montgomery, the county attorney in Maricopa County, is his chairman. and there was just something, and you probably don't get this. It's called the yellow sheet. Us political junkies get it. It comes out every day and it tells all the gossip, what's going on at the Capitol. That's why it's called the yellow sheet. Some of it's not fit to print in the regular Capitol Times. There's a lot of gossip, okay? So you got to be a sick individual, but you read it, but it talked about a fundraiser that he's having, and it's got all the Republican, I don't remember all the names right now. I know Montgomery's the chairman, and he's going to have that support, and he'll have the money. He's running traditional, or because he has that money. He's already raised $300,000, and so then APS has already formed a new political action committee, and they formed it in September, and they've already dumped, I think it's called Arizonans for Sustainable Energy Policy. And I call it Arizonans for Sustainable Income for APS. And I renamed it, right? But they've already dumped $3.2 million in it. So and it's sitting there. And so what they've done is, I'm speculating here. The lawyer in me, I'll say I'm speculating on this. That was fact, what I just told you. $3.2 million, and that's the name of the political action committee. But I'm thinking maybe they did it because they could do it, in this fiscal year, and maybe they'll be able to put more in next fiscal year. I don't know that for a fact, but they've already got it sitting there, $3.2 million. And so if they get to a roundabout way to get your question, if they get behind Eric Sloan, and they play in both the Democrat, let me just be clear, they play in both the Democrat and the Republican primaries. In 2014, they defeated two Republicans, Lucy Mason and Vernon Parker, who were perceived to be pro-solar, and APS beat them in the primary with Faris and Little. Okay, so they play in the primaries. They may play in the Democratic primary, depending on who they foresee, and I can speculate on who they think are going to be the toughest, which I believe Sandra and I will be in November, number one, and we have a history of standing up to them. I mean, I voted no on my last rape case with them. Sandra stuck up to them on in her 4 years on the commission. So that's, to answer your question, I think those are the people who get out of the primary on the Republican side.
So if we wanted to, me in particular, wanted to write some letters to the editor about Eric Sloan as a candidate, so you see his biggest vulnerability as being in charge of, and I have to see a very tiny notebook, so I'll be looking at the tape. But what did you think his vulnerability is?
I think his biggest one is that he was the chairman of the Pinnacle West APS Political Action Committee. He wasn't just, he was paid by them. He was the chairman of the Political Action Committee that ran the campaign against Tom Chabot and I in 2016.
Okay.
And so now 2 years later he's going to run for the commission, and then APS is going to come. It's like a court. It's like a court at the commission. That's why they're called commissioners. You've got APS on this side in the chairs with their army of lawyers. And then you have maybe RUCO over here and any customers that have decided to participate, just like in a courtroom. And so he's going to be, and the reason the commissioners are called commissioners, because up until about 1960, until the state got too big, they actually heard every case, the trial. And now there's administrative law judges, and I don't want to get too policy wonkish, but now the administrative law judges first hear the case, and then it goes to the commissioners for final vote. And what I've said to people is the commissioners are like the court of appeals within the commission, right? We make the final decision, but we don't sit through the 2 months of trials that go on. We get the decision of the administrative law judge, we review it, and then either affirm it, amend it, reverse it, send it back for more evidence. So that's, there's all sorts of material, as you said, but I mean, for heaven's sakes, how's the guy going to be objective when APS is sitting there and they just paid him whatever they paid him to be the chairman of their committee to run political campaigns against Tom and I in the last campaign. So a couple more, I'll end it here unless there's other questions. Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Are cable providers and satellite, like satellite TV, are these utilities?
No. In 1979, Congress preempted the states. When cable was just starting to happen, right, 1979, they ran to Washington with their lobbyists and got Congress to preempt the state commissions, not just the Arizona Corporation Commission, but all state commissions around the United States from having authority over cable companies and over, well, I don't know if satellites existed then, but so they only have jurisdiction over landlines. They do have jurisdiction over CenturyLink, you know, and landlines, and so you can use the bully pulpit. And what I tell people is, what I did was, as a commissioner, because you have jurisdiction over landlines, you can kind of use the bully pulpit to try to get them to be reasonable and fix things for customers, even though you don't have the hammer like you do in other cases of imposing fines or penalties. So no, they don't have direct jurisdiction. This lady has, you can't.
Go ahead.
This is a quick question. Is that a full-time job? Do you keep your lawyering?
No, well, I didn't. I gradually got rid of my cases, you know, when I first got appointed, because one day I'm practicing law in Chandler, next day the governor appoints me, so I just gradually farmed them out to other lawyers and got rid of them. I consider it a full-time job because you get paid $80,000 a year. It's not like the legislature. You get $80,000 a year, but a lot of these current commissioners have other jobs, which I don't know how you do. And in fact, we talked about corruption. Let's talk about that for a second. I'll take my jacket off. But, you know, we talked about corruption, but I talked about the former, you know, chairman getting indicted, remember? Well, there's other things that happened. Do you remember Susan Benner Smith?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, do you remember, that's what made me think of it, your question. Because she had a full-time job as the executive director of the Cable Association. Well, but part of that was landlines. So here she is lobbying for her association, making $200,000 a year. This all came out, you're taping me, so approximately, I don't know the exact amount, including her $80,000 salary. And then she also was lobbying for a landowner over a transmission substation in Scottsdale, even though the commission, as I told you, has jurisdiction over, you know, transmission lines and power plants, even though this was a smaller one, just the appearance of impropriety. And so she was forced to resign in lieu of the Attorney General had filed an action to force her to resign, and on the day the Supreme Court was to hear the case, she resigned. Now, what happened there? You're talking about Tobin. Well, what happened was the governor appointed Andy Tobin. Now, since statehood until 2 years ago or 3 years ago, whenever he was appointed, the commission had a stronger conflict of interest law than any other elected official in Arizona, whether it's the legislature, mayor, council, board of supervisors, school board. And then what did they do? What did Andy Tobin do? He ran down to the legislature and got them to weaken the conflict of interest law so he could serve. Because he had a conflict of interest. I mean, just Google all this stuff. I mean, you'll see it. I speak fact.
Do they take people over in Norway, you know?
I don't want to touch that one. So let me ask one. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one last thing that I don't know how complex this is. So if you have ATS, let's say, wants to develop a new energy plant using gas versus developing solar and storage capacity, if the companies that come in to do a bid for them to set up the solar or to set up this plant, do you have any control over what kind of subsidy or buy-in or you know, deal they make with these people to set up this energy producing facility?
On the back end, when they come in to try to include the expenditure in rates, every expenditure that a utility makes under utility regulation law has to be reasonable and prudent. If the expenditure they made to their subcontractors, in your example, is not reasonable and prudent, then the commission could disallow it. But they have the right to pick whoever they want to pick, and the price has to, though, be reasonable and prudent. So, and they couldn't pick, this company over here is qualified, and the normal amount would be, you know, $5,000, but they picked this one for $20,000, and they all, you know, in my example, they all have the same qualifications, they all have everything the same. The commission could disallow the $15,000 difference because it's not a reasonable and prudent expenditure by the utility. That's how that works. Now let me just ask a couple questions. I want to just say this because she's not here, and I know Sandra and I are running as a team. She's a former commissioner. I'm a former commissioner for 9 years. And how many of you are new to Arizona? Let's say in the last few years. Couple, 5. Okay, I'll let you off the hook on this question. Who was the last Democrat? Remember, we have no statewide Democratic elected officials, and we haven't for years. Who was the last Democrat elected statewide? Now, if you heard me say, no fair. Okay.
Gabrielle?
No, statewide. She was Congress. State, like governor or attorney general or U.S. Senate. Napolitano? Yeah, most everybody says Napolitano.
No, we had
Okay.
Didn't we have a treasurer?
No, we had a corporation commissioner, Sandra Kennedy, my running mate. She ran and won in 2008. She's the last Democrat to win statewide. Last one. So thank you very much for your time. As you can see, I enjoy talking about the commission. I hope that I'm honored to be first the Democratic nominee. So we have a contested Democratic primary. I hope I'm honored to be the Democratic nominee along with Sandra. And then I think we have the best shot at winning in November and turning Arizona blue and winning 2 seats on the commission. Yes.
Could you just explain? I understood that there were 2 teams, 2 Democratic teams. Is that wrong?
No, that's pretty accurate. I mean, you have Kiana Sears, and they say you're not supposed to say your opponent's names, but I'll say them. You asked me. You've got Jake Bell and Kiana Sears over here, and then you got Sandra Kennedy and me. What's proper English? Me. My mother would have. She's probably rolling over. So okay. So that's why I caught myself, didn't I? I caught myself. So we have that, and all I would ask people is, you know, look at our experience. I mean, I'm not going to be derogatory on other my opponents, but I would ask you in making your decision, look at our experience on the commission, you know, and when you make your decision on who can go back there and hit the ground running. We know where all the bodies are buried. I told you I was getting staff were calling me when I was off the commission saying, Bill, you can't believe what's going on here. So I know where the bodies are buried. I can get there on day one, and we're going to change the place and make it responsible to you all, the customers, and also clean it up. Steve, did you want to say something?
Going back to the thing in Wilcox, when Sandra and Paul were running, I helped run that campaign too. I was always helping the corporation. Anyway, the issue, cow farmers, they were real angry. They just put in all these drip systems to conserve water, and then they were really angry that someone was going to build a power plant and take all the water. Yeah. And I just wanted to throw that out because these things, you know, go on forever. And Paul Newman came of fame in that battle. He's a supervisor in Cochise County, and he wanted to know the economics of the coal that they were going to burn and why not renewables. And that was one of the reasons he decided to run on the solar team campaign in 2008. Now, there hadn't been a Democrat elected in 14 years at that point. So we huddled together, we came up with the solar team campaign. We got 2 of the 3 seats. We lost the 3rd seat by 2,000 votes out of 919,000. We almost got all 3. So it can be done. Since that time, and you can go back and look at the election results, you can have wonderful Democratic candidates, but unless they have a statewide reputation and name recognition, they always come in last. So I talked these people into this. I said, you're the only people who can win. And I'm telling you, I can tell you my story, because you're all active, you know what it's like. I have personally, since November, when they filed, gathered more than 3,000 signatures for each one of these people. And all I do is mention their name. They're going to stop the corruption. They sign. And no one to date has ever said, what corruption?
Oh, that's good, yeah, that's what I said.
That's why I have got Republicans say, I can't sign your petition, but I'm gonna vote for Bill Mundell and Sandra Kennedy. When they first announced they had a thing on Channel 12, Sunday Square Up, they said Sandra Kennedy and Bill Mundell will win the race, and they will join with Bob Ernst to drain the cesspool at the Corporation Commission. There's your quotable quote.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill Mundell.
Thank you. Thank you.